Hello and welcome. My name is Dan Rodney, and this is an intro to SVG. SVG are web graphics that can be animated, and we're going to be introducing you to that today. For those of you who are not familiar with Mobile Desktop, we've been around for over 30 years teaching design and code. So SVG is one of those things that doesn't get talked about on its own very much. It's one of those things that kind of just gets talked about in passing with HTML and CSS, but I think it's worth a dedicated look, seeing how to create them, how to put them into a web page, how to animate those. There's actually quite a lot that you can do with SVG and things to know about properly creating an SVG file. So this presentation link is in the video description down below on our YouTube video. So you can check out that video description down below for the link. It's nobledesktop.com/presentation/intro to SVG with dashes in there. This will stay up. You can use your arrow keys on the desktop to switch between the slides. You can also swipe on a touchscreen to switch between the slides. Today will be part lecture and kind of explanation, and part live coding and demonstration in the apps showing you how these things work. So what we're going to be discussing is what exactly is SVG, why we should be using it. I'll show you different examples of both static and animated SVG, how to create it, how to export it from our different apps properly, how to use it in a web page, and how to animate it as well. So lots of cool stuff to go over today. So what exactly is SVG? It is scalable vector graphics. It's basically a way to use vector graphics on the web. Prior to this, we had just pixel-based graphics, PNGs, JPEGs, GIFs, but we wanted native vectors because you can make them any size you want. They're great to use in web pages, but unfortunately right now, emails don't have the greatest support for them yet. Basically anything with emails is kind of old school, old technology, and SVGs are newer. Not that they're new anymore. It's been years since we've been able to use them reliably everywhere. So it's been a long time we can use them in web pages, but everything in emails is just kind of delayed typically because the support isn't as great. Primarily, they are used for vectors. They are scalable vector graphics, but in a way, they're think of it kind of similar as like a PDF, in the sense that if you have a PDF, you have the ability to have vectors in the PDF. You can have live text in the PDF. You can have images in the PDF. And in that same way, an SVG file is kind of a container format. And in an SVG file, of course, it's scalable vector graphics, so you can have vector graphics in there. But you can also have pixel-based graphics and live text if you need that, although the primary use that most people are using it for is vectors. But it is kind of a multi-purpose container format, but I wouldn't be creating it just for the purpose of putting pixel-based images or putting live text. It's just that technically SVG files can also contain those if need be. The format of them, SVG files are actually coded files. They are an XML-based image format. So XML is extensible markup language. So if you know HTML, which is hypertext markup language, the ML being the important part of this, it's a markup language. So with a hypertext markup language, there's a pre-made markup language that you're using, whereas XML is an extensible markup language, meaning that you can come up with your own tags. So it's XML-based. So it's a markup language. It looks basically just like HTML. If you're familiar with HTML and tags with opening and closing tags, this is going to look basically the same. It's just there's going to be different tags. So you'll have like G for group, and you'll have path, rect for rectangle. So you have graphic tags that you're going to have in there. But you can actually read it, and it is a coded format. So any app that's going to create an SVG file is going to essentially be writing code behind the scenes. And that's different from like a PNG or a JPEG, where you can't just open up a PNG and JPEG and just see the code and edit the code like you would an HTML or CSS file. But you can with an SVG file. So we'll be taking a look at some of the SVG code just so you can kind of see behind the scenes what gets written. And that's kind of important to think about, because when you're exporting from your graphics app and it's writing that code, there sometimes are options of how it writes the code that can produce either higher quality code or not so great quality code. So why use it? Number one, it's scalable vector graphics. You can use it in any size. You don't need multiple files. You can just have one file, use it small, use it big, any size you want. It used to be that with pixel-based graphics, if you made a really big graphic, it would be big, it would take a long time to download, so you'd have to make different sizes that were each optimized for that specific pixel dimensions in your web page. You don't have to do that with SVG. It looks great on any resolution screen, so 1x, 2x, even 3x. It will look great on low and high-res displays, again, with a single, small, quickly downloading image. It is normally smaller file size than a pixel-based image, so it would download faster. I say typically because it is possible to have really complicated vectors, so they can be large, but in general, just normally, they're going to be smaller. Now, when I first got started with this, I had been using PNGs a lot for these vector-based graphics, and I saved my first SVG file, and I noticed it was a little bit bigger than a PNG at that same small size. And I thought, well, wait, if this is a little bit bigger, why would I want to use that? But when you have a PNG or a JPEG, one of those pixel-based files, those have already been compressed. And that means that when you're serving them from a web server, that the web server cannot additionally compress those. And most web servers have something called GZIP on. There's also some other technologies that are similar to it, but that gzipping is a server compression that most browsers understand. And as long as gzipping is turned on your server, then any text file, so HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and SVGs are technically text files because they're coded files. They can be additionally compressed and sent to your browser, and then the browser decompresses them. That means that SVG files will be additionally compressed as long as you have gzipping turned on your server. That gzipping does not help PNG or JPEGs because they're already pre-compressed. So that means that most servers typically have gzipping turned on, and if it's not turned on, you can always turn that on. And that means that any SVG file will be smaller than the file size you're seeing if you just get info on your desktop computer. And gzipping can save, up to 60%. It depends on how much white space and comments and things are in there. Not comments, but white space and stuff, how much repetition there is. But it can typically save quite a bit. So generally speaking, even if when you get info on your desktop, if the SVG looks a little bit bigger, it's going to end up downloading quicker. Really importantly, SVG files, they can be animated with JavaScript or with CSS. And you can animate the pieces that are inside of that SVG file. That's something you just can't do with a pixel-based graphic, to animate the different pieces of it unless you split it apart into multiple different graphics. You can also style them with CSS. So you can change the fill or the stroke. You can change various colors. So you don't have to make either separate hover graphics or just separate versions. Let's say you need an arrow and you need lots of colors of that arrow. You could just change the color in CSS. So you don't have to create all these different versions of it. It's great. So let's take a look at some live websites. I'm sure as you've been browsing the web, you've seen SVG, whether you've realized it or not. But let's take a look at a couple static ones here. The various different icons and illustrations here are SVG. One of the ways that you can know that it's SVG is to right-click or control-click if you're on a Mac, and bring up your browser DevTools by choosing Inspect. If it didn't automatically go to the right thing, you would choose your little picker up here, hover over the thing that you want to look at, and click on it, and you'll see there are multiple ways you can use SVG in a web page. I'll be going over this and showing you how to bring it into a page in a little bit. But one of them is just using a regular image tag, but it's bringing in the SVG file instead of the JPEG or the PNG or pixel-based version. So one way is to look for the image tag, look for .svg, that's an SVG file. If I go find this one right here, open up that link to see what's inside of this, they've actually embedded the icon into the file itself, tag itself. And there are some advantages to doing that, and I'll talk more about that later when we talk about incorporating them into a page and doing things in the page with that. So you might directly see an SVG tag, or you might see an image tag, depends on how it's been used in the page. But the nice thing about those kind of icons, and let's see if there's anything else down the page. Probably the logo is as well. If we do an inspect, my guess is that the logo would also be, yep, the logo is also an SVG file as well. The advantage of those is they can be used at any size and they will be crisp and clean. So if you decide to change the size in the page, you don't have to go back to your graphics app and re-export the proper pixel-based resolution that you need now. You just resize it and you can keep using the same SVG file. So let's take a look at another one. Again, a lot of different examples here. All these little icons are typically going to be SVG, and you can confirm that by looking at your dev tools. You got SVG there. Over here, you got SVG there. So in this case, these are just being treated like a regular image. It just happens to be that they're a vector image. So again, you get flexibility of making it any size you want. Also, you get that nice small file size and the flexibility of changing colors and so forth if you need to. And so just a bunch of different vector graphics in here in this page. Okay, so those are all just static examples. But where SVG can get more interesting is that you can animate the stuff too. So let's take a look at some examples of animation. Okay, so I'm going to refresh this page here and take a look. Here we have strokes that are being drawn. And here we have some elements also being animated. There's, of course, other things, not just SVG, that are being animated on this page. But that's a pretty neat little entry animation there with the thing being drawn for you. Let's take a look at Stripe. Stripe has really cool animations all throughout their website of all different types. But if we scroll down, I'm curious, sometimes when you get logos from other companies, you can't find it, or sometimes PNGs, but no, in this case, it's an SVG file. And so you can take a look around here. So in this case, yeah, these are all SVG files. So you can see the SVG tag there, but sometimes you just can't find the vector version of those. And sometimes you end up being forced to use a PNG version of those, depending on what you can find. And let's keep scrolling down here. Okay, now these little icons down here animate constantly. So they're not kind of flashing in your face all the time. They're just little subtle animations. And if I inspect and I dive down in, look at that, there's an SVG tag. So those are SVG animations there as well. Again, here with some other icons, nice little vector icons there. And if you wait and watch a little bit, every once in a while, they'll animate. Kind of going across here. This will animate next. There we go. Okay. All right. So lots of different kind of examples here. This is a more complex thing, doing some 3D rendering stuff there. But continuing to look down here, lots of little SVG animations there that are quite nice. Okay, so let's take a look at another one. So that was Stripe. Let's go to this next one here. So this is a little animated game. You can go in here. This is interactive, so you can click on any of these individual areas. And if you watch, there's an animation. Pretty cool. If you inspect this, you can take a look and see SVGs. SVGs. These are done as image tags. Okay, so that's another example. Let's take a look at this one here. Scroll down. Ooh, look at all those little entrance animations there. That's pretty cool. So all of these also SVG animations. See, SVG once again. And And let's do one more. I know this has been around for a while, this PS4 review, but just watch the animations here. This is cool. These SVG files draw on screen. There's SVG files just as illustrations. Some of them are static, but every once in a while, they'll do a dynamic one and animate the strokes just to draw attention to it. So some are static and some are animated. So pretty cool examples there of some animated SVG. So how do you go about creating your SVG files? Well, most people are going to use a vector design app, some vector graphics app. There are a lot of different apps. You can use Adobe Illustrator, you can use Figma, which you can actually use the free version of Figma to do this. Sketch, Adobe XD, any vector design app is typically going to have some sort of SVG export. Technically, you can hand code them. It is a coding language that you can use. Most people are probably going to use their vector graphics app to design and export those, but it is a coded format. Those design apps are just turning your design into code, so it is technically capable. You are technically capable of coding your own SVG. It is possible, but most people are going to use their design app so they can visualize it and not have to write the code. And maybe you have it write the code and then you go in and maybe tweak the code a little bit, potentially. That could be a nice way to start seeing what code is written, is to export your code from your design app and then check it out and see what's there. Compare one app to another to see, how the quality of code is across your different design apps. All right, so let me show you how to go through and export from the various different design apps. And I'm going to be going over a variety of them. So let's say, for example, Illustrator, Figma, Sketch, Adobe XD. These are kind of the 4 main apps that I would think people would be potentially using. We're going to compare the different apps and kind of see what control you have over them, the proper ways of exporting them. There's some links here for your reference to come back to, but I'm going to start with Adobe Illustrator. And I've got some files here. And these files you can download on the very first slide of the presentation. You could download these same files in case you ever want to go back over these for practice in the future. And I've got our Noble desktop logo as well as an arrow that I can export. So I'm going to open up those 2 Illustrator files. And one thing I'm going to point out here is in the layers panel. The layers panel is where you can name your layers and you can create groups. And you can name your individual objects that are in here. In this case, we have the Noble desktop logo, and I've shown the transparent background by going in and doing the transparency grid. It's because there's some white in here. There's some characters there that are white. And so I showed the transparency grid just so you can see some of those white characters there. Those are the desktop characters right over here. Then I've got the Noble characters over here. Those are all grouped together in Noble desktop together. There's the background for the N, and then there's the N itself with all of the various different colors. Now, why would you care about naming every little thing in this case? If you are going to animate things later, you're going to want to have names for things. You can export and add IDs or your names later. They're going to be ID tags in your final file. But if you name them here where you can see, like especially with Illustrator, you can see the previews of these things and you can know what they are. You can also click the selection button here to highlight it over there so you can see what that is. Click on there, see what that is. It's going to be easier to name it here probably than naming it in your code afterwards. Also, if you're ever going to come back and make a change, if your names are here as opposed to being done in the code, here it's going to remember those names, so it's easier to make a tweak. Just re-export. You don't have to rename things again. So if possible, we want to try to keep our names that we've assigned our layers and our groups and keep those names when we go to do our export. Now, Illustrator has several ways of creating SVG files. I'm not even going to go into every single way, but save as is the way that we were able to do it a long time ago, and we can still do it, but there's newer ways that are preferred. So let me just say that while you can save as, and I'm going to save this to my computer. and I'm going to put this here. You can save as SVG. The quality of that code is not going to be as good. It's an older style code. It's more complex. It's not as good quality code as the other formats. So even though save as, you think that it would kind of be the way to go, that's not what we're going to do. Also, you don't want to do the compressed version. Leave the compression to your server so that you can have things like gzipping turned on in your server. That way you don't have to compress every single individual SVG file. You could just let your server do it to all. We typically just do regular SVG and then let the servers handle the compression. So we don't use SVG compressed. I'm going to put this here, and I'm just going to call this Illustrator, and I'm going to call it save as, just so we can compare the code here. And I'll click save. There are some options here as far as which versions that you can use, what would happen to type. So I don't actually have type. Everything that I have has been type converted into outlines already. But if you did have live type, would you want to keep it as SVG live type, or would you want to convert it to outlines? That depends on what you're doing. If you're doing something like a logo and you don't want to have to worry about fonts being loaded into your web page, you'd certainly want to convert to outlines. If you are using a font and that font is loaded in your web page, then you could keep it as SVG type, which would be better for accessibility. But this is a logo, so if I was doing a logo, I would convert to outlines. And again, in this particular case, it doesn't really matter because I don't actually have any type in my file. It's all being converted, so this isn't going to have any effect in my particular file anyway. Images, I don't have images in here. That would be pixel-based graphics, so I don't have to worry about if I'm embedding them or linking them. I'm also not going to preserve Illustrator editing capabilities, which would add more stuff to the file to make it more compatible with Illustrator. That's not to say you can't edit this in Illustrator. You could certainly open it back up and edit it in Illustrator. It's still going to be a vector graphic, but I don't want to add extra stuff, extra bloat to the file just specifically for Illustrator. I want the final optimized graphic to use in my page. So I'm going to click OK, and that's the save as, which I typically don't want to do. All right, so let me go back here and reopen up my original. So this is my Illustrator file. What's better than save as is export as. Export as is newer, and it's going to create better quality, cleaner code for you. There's also export for screens, which also is just kind of a different workflow, but that's going to do the same in terms of the quality of the code that you're going to get. But I'm going to keep this simple and just do export as. But either export for screens or export as are both quality exports in terms of the code that they write, better than save as. So under export as, notice that in this case, they got rid of SVG compressed because we don't do that. So they just got rid of that kind of old school thing that we don't need. So we're just doing regular SVG, and I will call this one Illustrator, and I'll call it export as, so we can compare these things. In here, again, you can deal with fonts. If there's live text, do you want to keep it as text, SVG live text, or convert to outlines? Doesn't matter in my case because I don't have that in my file. But see, here you have more control over how something like the styling is maintained. Is it going to write CSS inside? So you have a style, and then you can edit that style. Is that like a separate CSS area, like a style area, or is that inline styles? Is it turned into HTML presentation attributes? So there's a variety of ways you can write this CSS. So let's actually just see the internal CSS, just so you can see how this is done. Also notice your object IDs. So those are your names. You're going to get an ID attribute on each of these elements. And I'd want it to be my layer names because I've named these layers and I want it to keep those layer names. You can choose a decimal precision here, which when it's creating the coordinates for these points, you can choose how many decimal places long. This affects the quality of the rendering, but also affects the file size. So depends on how big you built your original thing. You typically don't need too many decimal places long because the more decimal places you add, the more that adds to your file size and will increase it. So you don't want to be kind of too low, you don't want to be too high. So 2 typically is fine for most situations. Also, these two options here, minify is going to remove things like white space, all the spaces and tabs and the line breaks. So if you minify, your code is going to be ugly. but it's going to be smaller. So if you're not editing your code, that's fine. You can always minify it later if you need to anyway. So if you're not editing it, you can certainly minify, save yourself a little bit of file size. If you are going to be editing it, if you want to make it more legible, like I want to, because I want to show you this, I'm not going to minify it. Again, I could always minify it later. Now, responsive is, I think, a horribly named option. I don't like that it's called responsive, because when we're creating web pages, we typically like them to be responsive. So that implies that you always want responsive to be checked on, right? So what responsive really means is don't include a width and a height on the SVG. If you uncheck that, it will include a width and height on the SVG file. And what that means is when you check on responsive, it leaves off the width and height. It does not know how big you made this. And so this SVG will just scale up or down to fill whatever container you put it in. But to me, if I'm building this at a specific size, let's say this is part of a design, and I've built it at the right size, I've created it at the default size I want it to come into, I want to uncheck that, because that would include a width and height on the SVG. Now that's just a default width and height, that it just comes in with that made. Think about like social media icons. If most of the time you want to use your social media icons at a certain size, you could design them at that size, include the width and height on those icons, and when you bring them in, they already come in at the right size. If you check on responsive, it leaves off the width and height, and then you have to code that in when you're doing, let's say, your CSS of your web page, because there's no height built into the icons, and therefore you'd have to use CSS to style that height. There's no completely right or wrong answer here. It just depends on your situation as to how you want the images to work. But if you want it to come in at the size you brought it, then uncheck responsive. You will still be able to override the size. You will still be able to make it bigger or smaller. It's just a default starting size. If you uncheck responsive, it knows the starting size. You can always override that. If you check responsive, then it does not remember the original size, and you must always specify the size every time you use it via CSS. So I'm just going to uncheck that, just so you can see that it actually codes that width and height into the SVG. All right, and let's take a look at those two things. Now I already have this folder open in VS Code, so I'm going to go there and let's go here. So Illustrator. So the export as, this is the second way that I exported it. The save as is the first way. So first of all, they put in this comment. I don't care that Illustrator generated this. I don't care that it used that plugin, the version of it. So that's just extra stuff that they don't need. Also, there's this XML that they don't need as well. You can actually leave that off if you want to, although they do include it here as well. Technically, that could be left off. You know, here you don't have that part right there. And also, just looking at all of this code here compared to this, when you're looking here, so here you can choose the decimal places in the export as. In the save as, you don't get to choose how many decimal places. So save as looks like it was doing 1 decimal place, is what it looks like. Yeah, it was using 1 decimal place. Also, the way that it just writes this stuff up here is just a little bit different than export as. So you're going to get some cleaner stuff with export as. Let's take a look at what export as does. I'm not a big fan of the way that they name their classes for styling. So this is the one where we chose to include like embedded CSS. And so they say, oh, let's create class number 1, class number 2, class number 3. And they put on different fill colors. And that style tag goes down and relates. So that's class 8. So class 8 has this fill. Now, I just don't think that's very clean code in terms of being legible. Can I change that fill up here and change every place? Sure, I can do that. But it's called class 8. Like, it doesn't have a great name for that. So because of that, I would rather typically not use that. Of course, it depends on what your intent is. But let me go back to export as. And this time, this one is going to be export as. This is going to be version 2. And this time, instead of internal CSS, which is that style tag, let's see inline styles. We'll see all 3 versions of this. And then let's also, while I'm here, just export as, and we'll create a version 3. So we'll do this as version 3. And this one's going to be the last one, presentation attributes. That's typically my favorite one, the one that I usually like. Let's see the difference of those. So this was that kind of embedded CSS. Then we have the inline. So the inline CSS still uses CSS. It still uses style, but it does it inline. So every place that that color exists, in that one thing, you've got that color written on that. So you don't have to think about, is this class 1, class 2, class 3, whatever. Technically speaking, that does make it harder to do global updates, but I'm not a big fan of the class names anyway, and I'm typically not doing global updates by editing the CSS in here. I'm typically doing that in my design app. I'm going back to Illustrator to do that. Lastly, the one where it was presentation attributes. With presentation attributes, they don't do the style attributes. They just do fill. So this is kind of more like embedding it directly as like, I know this isn't HTML, but like if you're used to HTML, just putting stuff directly into the HTML, kind of the old style way, this is directly putting in with like SVG attributes. And it actually is a little bit less code, because here you have to have style equals and then fill, because you're using CSS to do the fill. When you're using presentation attributes, you're using straight SVG attributes, so you don't have to say style. So it's actually a little bit less code. And then also, the reason that I like presentation attributes over either of the CSS options is when you get into CSS specificity, if you have inline styles are hard to override. Whereas if you have presentation attributes, your CSS will override those presentation attributes. So these presentation attributes are not only less code, but they are easier to override when you go to add your CSS to override what's in there. That's going to be easier to override than embedded CSS, or sorry, inline CSS or embedded CSS. So that's, for me, why I like to use presentation attributes. And, you know, comparing file sizes, if we are comparing those 3 file sizes, you know, pretty similar for the most part. These 2 are a little bit smaller there. And if I go and get info on these, just to compare these 3, the presentation attributes are a little bit smaller. It's 4.2 instead of 4.36. So a little bit smaller. Doesn't save a tremendous amount, but it does save some. But more importantly for me is that it makes it easier to override using CSS later on. Okay. So that's a little look behind the scenes of Illustrator's export. Notice that the IDs have made their way through. That's good, because we're going to want those when we animate. Also, the width and height, notice that those are included. That's because I unchecked responsive. Let's do one final export from Illustrator so we can compare. If I export this as, and I'll do one last one, and I'll say 3, I'll call it responsive, because we're going to turn on responsive here. This responsive. That just, the only thing that does is leaves off the width and height. Just gets rid of it. That's all it does. So now when I compare this responsive one, it just left off the width and height. That's all it did. Just didn't include that code. And because it didn't include that code, when I bring this into a web page, the one with the width and height, it'll come in at that size. The one that's responsive will come in and it will just fill the entire size of whatever container it's sitting in. So it'll just explode up and get really big. I can even see that on my desktop. If you're on a Mac, you can hit the space bar to preview. And notice that this is a scalable image here, so it scales up. I know you can't see over here the white letters because the Mac, when you do this spacebar preview on the Mac, they're not perfect in their preview. The background here should be transparent, but it's not because the preview isn't perfect. But there should be white letters here on a transparent background. But the key thing here is that notice that the responsive one is scaling up and down to fill whatever it's sitting inside of, as opposed to the other one, which actually knows the size that it was made. All the rest of this stuff is just Apple not doing the greatest job previewing SVG files. It really should just be the size of the actual original artwork. But it knows how big it was because that was coded in there. Luckily, if you are getting a file where, let's say another person prepped your SVG for you and they left responsive checked on, and you're like, oh man, they left responsive checked on, so they didn't give me the width and height. Let's take a look at the one that with the width and height. Notice how this width matches this number right here, and how this height matches this right here. So there's this thing called the view box, and the view box, just kind of think of it as like your document size. I'm just going to simplify this, but it's a viewable box. If your SVG graphics are in that box, typically you'll see it inside that box. And so it knows how big to make that box. And so the width matches the first of those numbers, and then the height matches the second one. So this is kind of like a coordinate system. It starts on the top left and then goes over to the bottom right. So it has to say how wide and how tall to make that box. That's useful because if you didn't have these two numbers, you could figure them out by these two numbers. And those are included because it does have the view box. So the first one there, that's the width. So you could code that width in if they checked on responsive and didn't give it to you. You could just say the width is that first number. Let's copy and paste that. And then the height is equal to, and this is like coding HTML. The height is that. Okay, so you could always code that back in if need be. All right, so that's how you do it from Illustrator. What about other design apps such as Figma or Sketch, Adobe XD? How would we do it from those as well? Let me pop over into Figma. And I've already got this file in here. If you are ever trying this with the demo files, you could import, and I gave you a demo file here that you can import, which is this file that I've already got in here. So I'm going to open this up. Taking a while to open. Maybe while that's opening, I can go open my files in my other design apps. So I'll go to Adobe XD and open up my Adobe XD version, and also go to Sketch and open up my Sketch version as well. I'll let that other one open up in the background. Sketch, there we go. All right, so I'm in Sketch, so let's just do that right now. Notice over here, still have all of those groups, still have all of those layer names and everything for all of those different elements. And I want to export this as an SVG. So over here on the right here in Sketch, I go to make exportable. I don't need to worry about size 1x versus 2x once I've switched over here to SVG. So I choose my format as SVG. The size goes away because I don't need to worry about 1x versus 2x. I just choose my SVG format. There aren't options that I set here. I just choose export selected. And I'm going to call this Noble Logo -sketch so that I can remember that that's from Sketch, and save that like so. We'll go through, we'll do the different exports, and then we'll take a look at the code that was written. In Adobe XD, they don't have like a mark for export with options. They do have a mark for export, but that's just so that you can use either sharing it with developers through a share link, which is the main reason that that's been there, or you can do a export batch, but really that's mainly meant for the share links. So since we're going to directly export this ourselves, we don't need to worry about that mark for export. All I need to do is select it and then go to export that selected thing. I could also select multiple ones if I want to export multiple things. But actually, before I do, just to reiterate here, everything is same groups. We didn't actually name those things in there because we didn't need to, but same groups, same names. Basically, all that stuff is still there. And I'm going to export that selected thing. And I'm going to choose SVG. Here we do have some Illustrator-ish kind of settings. Again, we can do internal CSS or those presentation attributes. And as I said with Illustrator, I prefer the presentation attributes as opposed to the internal CSS. If there are graphics, pixel-based images, do you want to embed those or link? I don't have pixel-based graphics, so I don't need to worry about that. You can minify this, which is going to remove things like white space, but it would also remove IDs as well, which is not a good thing. So let me export this as XD, and first I'll do one that's minified, just so we can compare the minified versus non-minified, and then I'll re-export another one with just a regular non-minified. So we'll export that once, and then I will also export again. This one I will not minify, so I'm not going to minify it this time. And let's do date modified. So this one is not minified. Okay. And let's go back in. I did do, let me just make sure. I think I made sure that that was still presentation attributes, right? Yeah, still presentation attributes. Good. Okay. So Figma has opened up. So let's take a look at Figma. We'll go through, we'll export all these, and then we'll take a look at the code that it produced. I select this, and once again, look over here. My groups are named, my layers are named, so all that good stuff is still the same setup. This is a little bit more like Sketch in the sense that you go over to Export on the right, click the plus button. This is more Sketch-like. Choose SVG. Now, there is an option here if I click the little ... for export settings. Do you want to include the ID or not? Yes, if I'm going to be animating this and referring to the things that are inside, I definitely want to include the ID attribute. That is not checked by default. So you want to make sure that you go into that little ... and make sure that you include that ID attribute. All right, so now I can export this. Click export, and this is Figma. And let's go to my desktop here and put it here. Okay. All right, so I've got all of those. Let's take a look at the code differences. Let's go back to VS Code and let's look at Figma's. Looking pretty clean. Notice that they don't give that XML tag up at the top like Illustrator did, that XML that we don't need. So Figma chose not to include that. Sketch did include it. XD did not include it. So Sketch and Illustrator are the only ones that included that XML, which is not necessary. Figma and XD were smart enough to not include that. We do have our groups. We have our IDs because in Figma, so this is Figma again, we checked on to include the IDs. So that's all good. When we're in Sketch, Sketch also did include the IDs. So we got our IDs, we got our IDs. They did include some other ones from like the page that I'm on, the artboard that I'm on. So they did kind of throw in some extra groups, and they also threw in a title, which not a big fan of those kind of extra groups that Sketch decided to add. Adobe XD, let's look at the not minified version of it. Adobe XD did not add those extra groups, and Figma did not add those extra groups. So Figma and XD are exporting cleaner stuff than Sketch, and slightly cleaner than Illustrator in some ways. But that XML file, XML tag, you could always delete that if you don't want it. Now, with the Adobe XD, notice that in the minified version, there are no IDs. Like if I find for ID, there's no ID equals. It's not there. So minifying in XD doesn't just remove white space, it removes the IDs. If you want your IDs, do not minify from Adobe XD. And Figma doesn't have a minified, but they don't add all the extra spaces. So they somewhat minify in some ways automatically. Not fully minimized, minified, but somewhat there. So XD, I would say, and Figma are kind of leading in terms of kind of the cleanliness of the SVG code that they write. Pretty similar for the most parts. And if you look at the file sizes, let's take a look at Figma, Sketch. Sketch is the largest there, and XD is actually a little smaller than Figma. And I think part of that is because of the number of digits. So Adobe XD is just going to like one, yeah, it looks like they're going to like 1 digit, whereas Figma is going to like 4 digits. So 3 digits. So they're doing more digits. So that's going to take more code. They're going to be technically more accurate in their rendering, but they do take up a little bit more space for that accuracy. XD is accurate enough, so it shouldn't be a problem. So pretty similar. All of them are usable as long as you use the right settings. You can use it from any of those apps that are out there. All right. So as far as reference for what we just talked about, there's a link here. I have an article on my website because Illustrator has so many settings to do. I put on here what I think are my preferred settings here. I did check on minify. If you want your code more legible, you don't have to check on minify, but things like presentation attributes and making sure you include your layer names, and not checking responsive, so you get that width and height. Those are kind of my recommended settings from Illustrator. So there's a link there. There's also an SVG optimizer. So if you have some kind of big code and you want to reduce it down, let's say from any of these, you might be able to further optimize your code. And let's say I want to drag on the Illustrator. So, or actually, you know what, let's do Sketch. So Sketch was kind of big, right? That was 8K. You can drag that on to this website. You can just drag it on there. And you can see the original versus the final to see if there's any differences. And you can, I'm pinching to zoom in here on my trackpad. You could also zoom in with Command plus and minus, Control plus and minus on Windows. You can see this preview here, so you can see the original and the after, and ideally there shouldn't be any change there if everything's working well. But you can see this has reduced it down 52%. Here you can choose a precision of how many decimal places you want it. Now if you go too low, you will notice that some things shift around. If you go too low with your precision, things shift a little bit. So I don't want to go too low, but really in this case, anything higher than 1 isn't really changing how it looks. So you can play around with the size here and see, you know, what's the smallest you can get it. They can do things like remove the doc type, and you can actually look at the markup up here. So you can see, like, if you're turning things on and off. So if it had the XML doc type, it could remove that. So there's different things. Yeah, see, like that XML instructions up there, you could remove that. So you have some different options that you can use to minify your file, see how it looks, both in terms of the markup and the final images, as long as it looks good. And you know, be careful of removing IDs. I think that was an option over here, because we want to make sure we keep our IDs. We want to keep those, and I forget where that is here. There's an option in here. I'm not going to take too long trying. Oh, clean IDs. There you go. Unless you want to get rid of them for some reason, like you don't need those. If you're going to do things like animations and you need those IDs, make sure you don't clean out those IDs. Make sure you keep those IDs. Yes, that would be a way to reduce the size of your file if you don't need them. So it just depends on what you're doing here. But you can see the code and you can see your final image. If you like it and it's reduced the file size, you can download it, and then you've got a cleaner coded, smaller file size for your SVG. Also, if you want to learn more about that view box thing that I was talking about, Sarah has a great article here. She's a great proponent of front-end coding, HTML, CSS, SVG. She does a lot of stuff with SVGs. She's also a bird lover, so she's got fun illustrations here with birds. Nice way of illustrating these things. So she's got a great article, goes really into depth. She's got a lot of great articles on her blog. Highly recommend reading that if you want to learn more about coding, the coding side of SVG. So as far as using these final things in a web page, you can use them like any image. So you can use an image tag, just a standard old image tag, or a background image in CSS. You can also just copy and paste the SVG code directly into your HTML. And there's some reasons why you want to or don't want to do this. The advantage is you can style it with CSS, because once those actual shapes are in your file, in your HTML file, you can style it with CSS. You can also animate them individually because they're actually in there. Instead of treating it like one whole image with an image tag, the pieces with their IDs can be in your HTML page and individually addressable. What's the disadvantage? Well, because you've embedded that SVG code into your page, if let's say you're including that on every single page, you have to re-download that on every single page. So it's not caching that graphic for reuse across multiple pages like would happen with an external reference to an image. So it just depends on what you need to do. It depends on your size. There's a time and a place for all of these uses. So let me show you how to do that. I'm going to go back to my VS Code where I've got an example here. So I've got this starter website here. I've got a finished version just for future reference in case you want to poke around in the code of the final thing, but I've got this starter file here that I'm going to open up, and I'm going to preview this in my browser. All right, so there's a place to put the logo, and then down here with these buttons, I want to put in the arrow that we have. So there were arrow graphics there. I've already exported the logo, and I've exported the arrow, and I placed them into this little website folder. So I've got my image folder, and I've got my arrow SVG, and I've got my normal desktop SVG. Those files are already saved into that image folder. And I'm going to put them here into this web page. First, let's see, just inserting them as a normal image tag. So I would use just my normal image tag, which has a source attribute. I'd go into my image folder, and then in this case it's the logo, so I'd put in the logo. It's always recommended that you use alternate text, so if somebody is vision impaired or blind and having the web read to them, they want to know what that image says, and this says Noble Desktop. So that's a perfect alt tag for that. Save that and go back, refresh, and it comes in. Now, let's go back for a second and take a look at the image that I've got there. Notice that there is a width and height in place there. If I were to delete that width and height, then notice how big it gets and that it's flexible. So it automatically scales up to be the size of whatever it's sitting inside of. This page has a container that limits the width from getting too wide. And so if there's no width and height, remember in Illustrator you could check on responsive, and responsive would mean no pre-programmed width and height. This is why I like the width and height if I've built my SVG at the size I want them. Again, it's just a default size. It's just an initial size. It's not that they have to be locked into that size. If you want to go in and alter it, you can. You can change it. It just starts at the size you built it, assuming you built it at the right size. But you know, if you want to, like here, I could put on a, actually I'll do that back here. I could put on a class called logo, and this page is already linked to a CSS file, so I can go into my CSS, and if I come up here and say my logo has a width of 200 pixels, then it can change the size. I could say to make it 600 pixels, and it makes it bigger. You can always override that. That's not a problem. But do you want to always have to code in the width and height? If it's built into the SVG file itself, you don't have to. All right. Now, if I want to bring in the arrow into here, I can grab the arrow SVG as an image, just like I did here. I want to have the by now and then have a little arrow there. But I don't want to put this in as an image. And the reason is because my arrow, and let me just grab it real quick. Let me just put in an image tag of my arrow. It's a black arrow. I want it to match the text color. And the text color of the two buttons, I'm going to make them different. And I want it to take on the color of the current text that I've got. I don't want to have to build multiple arrows and have multiple downloads of different colors. I just want the ease of having one arrow that I can copy and paste in there, and I could just tweak the color of it. So, so I'm going to get rid of this right there, and I am going to embed the SVG into here. So I'm going to go to my arrow, and this is the code to create that arrow. It's an SVG tag wrapped around, in this case, a path, and yeah, just a path for that arrow. So I'm going to copy that and paste it into there, and I'm going to paste it in again here. So I'm embedding that 2 places. Save that, come back and hit refresh. Now I need to size it, and I need to get it to be the color of my current text. So I can go to my SVG, my CSS file here, and I'm going to put this over here on the side, just so we can see both of these things at the same time. In this case, these are links that have a class of button. Both of these have a class of button. This one has also a class of secondary button. So this one is just plain button, this one is button and secondary button. I already have a style for buttons that, you know, get rid of like the text decoration and that sort of stuff. That gets rid of it off the link, so it doesn't have an underline. But the SVG itself, I'm going to uncomment this out here. I'm just going to delete this comment there, just so I don't have to write out all the code. I'm just going to set the height, and I'm going to put a little bit of margin on the left-hand side. So this is the SVG tag inside of button. If you wanted to add a class to the SVG tag, by all means, you could add a class to that. You would just say class equals, and then write whatever class, and you could target that class if you prefer to do it that way. But I'm going to target an SVG tag in a button to size it, and put a little space on the left. And did I save that? No, I did not save that. So I got to save that file. That always helps. There we go. So it just makes it a little shorter, puts a little space on the left. Still is not taking on the color of the text. So that's the next part that I want to do. I'm going to delete the comment here. Now, when we're looking at the SVG itself, the tag, is just the container. In there is a path, and there is a stroke color on that. So it's a lined path. Now, sometimes things are fills, sometimes they're strokes. In this case, it's a stroke. It doesn't say a fill. If it said fill, I would be changing the fill attribute. But since this is a stroke, I'm changing the stroke attribute. So again, that could be fill if you have fills. And I'm using the CSS option called current color. If you're not familiar with current color just means the current text color, whatever that text color is. In this case, the current color is that blue that I've set on the buttons. That's the current text color. All right. So I'm just setting the stroke to match the text color. And I'm doing that on the path that's in my SVG tag that's in a button. And now that matches. Nice. Going a little bit further, we can also add a hover. So on my buttons, I can add a hover that changes the text to red. And guess what? The path will always be the current color, whatever that current color is. Normally that's blue, except when you're hovering, that will be red. So now I'm getting 2 different appearances, all from the same thing. We're just going in and styling that stroke to be a different color. Going even a little bit further here, if I want to make that second button look a little different, because that has a class of secondary, I can make the secondary button black instead of blue. I can also make it a little bit smaller. Because my button height is 0.8 ems, that's 0.8 of the current type size, it's going to be relatively sized to whatever the current font size is. So I chose specifically a flexible size there, as opposed to a pixel-based size. So that way when this text gets a little smaller, the arrow will shrink down with it. And notice it's black. Oh, see, I have black and I have blue. And I have red when I hover over, because current text color goes with the current color for that specific area. I might want a different hover color for the secondary. So I could say, hey, for the secondary, you know, if that's black normally, when I hover over that secondary button, let's make it a gray. So with one graphic that I copied and pasted, I get a blue arrow that's big, I get a red arrow that's big, I get a black arrow that's small, and a gray arrow that's small as well. So you can use your CSS to style the fill or the stroke of your SVG elements. If you have something more complicated, by all means, you can come in here and add IDs or classes or whatever to your various different things within your SVG tag, should you need to do that. All right. So that's the starter. The done one is just the finished version of that, in case you want to reference it as far as the finished version. So that's using it in a web page, but there is more. Couple things before we switch to things like animation. When you're using icon fonts, some people like to use icon fonts in the final web page. I'm fine with using icon fonts while I'm designing in Figma, Sketch, Adobe XD. No problem using an icon font at that stage. But when it comes to using an icon font in the web page itself, I do not recommend it. Icon fonts themselves can be large because they're including all of the icons. Most people don't use all of the icons in an icon font, they only use a few of them. But you have to still download the entire font. So it's not very efficient in terms of file size. Also, icon fonts have limited styling with CSS. You can only do one color. But with SVG, because each part, each piece could have a different class or ID, you could do different styles for different parts of it, so you have more options when dealing with SVG compared to an icon font. Also, icon fonts, because they're just one character at a whole, not all the separate pieces that are part of it, you can't animate it as much as you can with an SVG file, because SVG gives you access to all the little pieces that are inside of there if you need that. But to be honest, the biggest reason as well that I don't like icon fonts is they're not semantic, which semantic means meaningful, and they can be difficult with screen readers. So they're not very good for accessibility. Google even recommends to use icon fonts with caution. They kind of warn you against it. If you click on this, you can read more about that. They even warn people about doing that. And so for me, that's actually the biggest reason why I don't like using icon fonts. Use them in your design app, but just convert them to SVG, export the SVG, and use that in your page. You're going to get more flexibility all around, and I'm going to prefer those over icon fonts when it comes to coding the final web page. Bring us finally to animation. You can do, for simple stuff, you could do CSS animations. For a simple little thing, you can do that. I'm going to show you an example of a simple little animation with CSS. If you need something more complex, you can use JavaScript. Specifically, I would recommend GreenSock. GreenSock is a great way to animate things in a page. I'll be showing you an example of that. If you want to learn more about GreenSock, I just this morning did a webinar on Intro to GreenSock Web Animation. You should check out that video. It's here on our YouTube channel. And we also teach JavaScript and GreenSock in our JavaScript for Front-End course. All of our courses can be done typically live online as well as in New York City. So if you want to come to our school in New York City, you can. But if you can't make it to New York City, then you can take our classes live online. All the times on our website are in Eastern time because we're based in New York City. So keep that in mind as far as attending those courses live. When you animate your SVG, you have to put that SVG inline, meaning you have to copy and paste it into your HTML to get access to all the stuff in there. You're not going to be using the image tag. Now, if you just want to move the whole thing around as one piece, the image tag is fine. But when you want to do the pieces inside, that's when you need to put the actual SVG code copied and pasted into your HTML so that you have access to all the pieces that are inside of that. So let me show you what I'm talking about here. Okay, so we're going to start with the CSS animation. So if you want to do a simple little animation, like maybe moving that arrow when you hover over it, you can do that the way we've done it here. So I'm going to open this up in my browser. All right, so there's no animation here, and I want it that when I hover over, I want that arrow to like move away a little bit and have that just subtle little animation. Not a complex animation, just a little move. It can move closer, move further away, whatever you want to do, but I just want it to move a little bit. So that can be done through CSS. You don't need JavaScript for just a simple little move like that. Before I show you the CSS, it's important that I have pasted in my SVG here. Although actually, now that I think about it, technically for this, if you're just moving the entire thing, this could work for an image tag. Anytime you're moving the entire thing or scaling the entire thing, it's okay to use the image tag. So in this case, I have it embedded because I'm doing the coloring. But if you weren't doing the coloring, if you're just popping that in there and you're just moving the whole thing, an image tag works fine. So this particular technique doesn't require it to be embedded SVG code. I'm going to go to my CSS here. Now, here I've got the hover that I want to do. And the SVG, I want to change the amount of margin on the left. We're going to move that SVG arrow over to the right. So we're starting with 0.1 ems. We're going to move it to 0.4, just adding a little bit of space to the left of that SVG. So I'm going to uncomment this code here so that hover state will work. And now that SVG file moves. Now it's just moving kind of bump, 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 bump. It's not that slick. It's not smoothly animated because there's no CSS transition right now. So it's just go bump, bump, bump. And I want it to be a smooth transition. So that's where the CSS transition comes in. And it's on the SVG itself, not on the state, like not on the hover state that you're doing. You do it on the original element to say this SVG element, when it moves or changes or does something, let's add a transition. And it can transition any of the various properties. In our case, we're doing margin, but it could be whatever. If you're doing a transform with a scale, a rotate or something, it could transition those things and take 0.15 seconds to do that animation. So I'm going to uncomment this code, and that will add a time element, which will animate this for us. This is not specific to SVG files. This can be used on other things. And so now I get that little boom, boom, and it's sliding over instead of just jumping and then jumping back. So if you're just doing simple stuff like this, SVG works great with CSS animations. But if you want something more, you can do JavaScript animations. And again, just in this case, in this example, I did not have to be embedding that. I could have done that with just an image tag. That would have been fine. All right, let's close those up and let's go to the GreenSock one. And again, for each one of these, I've got the starter and the finish, just in case you want to look at the finish code. But I'm starting with the starter one, which is the unanimated thing. And let's open that up. All right, so I've got my SVG file put into here. Now, I'm going to be animating the pieces. So I have to make sure that I've included all my SVG code in this HTML file. So if I look down here, I've got that SVG tag copied and pasted here into this document. I've got all my G tags, which are for groups. So I've got a group for the whole Noble desktop. And if I close that up, I've got the Noble desktop. I've got the N background, which is that black rounded rectangle background. And then I've got the N, which is these little color parts to the N. So those are kind of the three main parts that I'm going to be animating separately. This is all sitting in an SVG tag. This is a little bit small on the page. It was brought in at the size that it was built, but I want to change that. Notice it has the width and height coded in there, so it knows its kind of default original size. I want to use some CSS to play around with that. So I can come in here and say, well, let's make the width 100% and the height will be automatic. So it'll be proportional. There we go. Now I said 100%, so it scales up to fill its container. There's actually a little bit of padding on the page, so that's why it doesn't go quite up against the edge of the page. I really don't want it to quite go up that big because that's a little bit big. It's a little small before, now it's too big. So I'm going to put on a maximum width just so it can't get too big. The width will be nice for the small screens, and the max width will make it so that the big screens don't get too big. There we go. So nice on small screens and can't get too big on the big screens. Very good. Okay, I'll come back and explain this in a little bit once we can visualize that. That is for a little bit later. All right, so GreenSock. Let's take a look at the GreenSock website. GreenSock is a great way to animate things, really animate anything within a web page. It's JavaScript, although you can still do quite a bit without even knowing JavaScript. So it's okay if you have never seen JavaScript before. I'm going to still get you through this because it has its own syntax. Granted, there's a whole lot more you can do if you know JavaScript, but you can still get started even if you don't. This little link right here is to the JavaScript file, which is the GreenSock library. So what GreenSock allows you to do is once you load in their JavaScript library, you can use the features in that library to animate things. It's specifically geared for people animating in a web page. And you can animate pretty much anything within a web page. SVG is just one of the many things that you can animate. So I need that link to copy and paste into my web page, which I've already done. I have a script tag because this is JavaScript, and there's a source, and I pasted that link into here. So this is the end of the script tag. This is the start. So that loads in the JavaScript library, the GreenSock JavaScript library. There's also an option if you want to download it and store it locally in, like, let's say a JavaScript folder, you could do that. But just to get things started quickly, it's easiest just to grab this content delivery network link, which everybody can use. That does not change the page by itself. We can use those features built into GreenSock to animate. So we're going to need another script tag, and this could be a separate shared file if you wanted to, but I'm just keeping it in this page to keep things simple. I've got a script tag that starts and ends, and we're going to put all of that stuff in here. Notice that it is at the end of the page, right before the end of the body tag. That way I know that all of these other things have already loaded, so that when I start to refer things, I know that those graphics or images or text or whatever it is that I'm going to animate would all already be loaded into the DOM, the document object model. So everything's already loaded and they're accessible by the time I go to refer to those. So I put that script all the way at the bottom of the page. Here is the idea of the way that GSAP works. So GSAP is the GreenSock Animation Platform. That's officially what this whole thing is called. So GreenSock is the company, and the GreenSock Animation Platform is what we were using, GSAP. They have an object which has different methods. You can say to animate to something or from something, and you're going to say what element you want to target. So what do you want to animate? And then what do you want to change? What are the variables? What are going to animate as part of this animation? And that's basically the idea. Target something and say what you want to change. It knows how the page currently looks. And this could either be the starting or it could be the ending. In our case, this is how we want it to end. So we want to animate from some other appearance. So it'll animate to this final appearance. The to part is already done. The from part, I want it to animate from slightly over, from an opacity of 0. So it'll fade to this opacity. Right now it's an opacity of 1. It's 100%. So I want it to fade in or move in, something like that. Because there's going to be a sequence of things, I want the noble desktop to animate. Then I want the round rectangle to animate. And then I want the end to animate. There's a sequence of things. There is a timeline of events. GreenSock has a timeline that we can build. So the GSAP object can create a timeline. And we're going to put that in a variable, which is a way to name that thing. This name can be anything you want. And in a lot of cases, you'll see in a lot of tutorials and stuff, you'll see people just call it TL for short because they don't want to write out the word timeline. But whatever you call that, we just called it generically timeline. Later, when you want to animate, you will say in that timeline, whatever that name is. So if that's TL up there, this would also be TL down here. TL there. But I'm just going to keep it timeline just to keep it nice and legible. Once you have that timeline created, then you can start to put things into that timeline. So let's see here. Into our timeline, we're going to put in our first animation. We're going to say from this appearance, what do we want to animate? The target, the noble desktop, the thing that has an ID of noble desktop. So what has an ID of noble desktop? If we look up here, there's the N. And then there's the noble desktop. So the noble desktop, those are the two pieces, the text for noble and desktop. So this group for those two words, noble desktop. And that's got an ID because our graphics app maintained the layer name that we gave it in our graphics app. Okay, so we're saying, tell the noble desktop text to animate from an opacity of 0. the duration or length of that animation will be 0.4 seconds. So very quick. Also, while we're doing that, let's move it over. But actually, before we move it over, let's just have it fade in. I'm going to cut that for a second. I'm just going to have that fade in. So let's see that. I'm going to hit refresh. And, well, that fades in really quick. Let's have that take 4 seconds, just so you can see it better. Duration of 4 seconds. So now it's taking 4 seconds to fade that text in. Not very exciting. Let's make it a little more interesting. We'll have a quick animation there again, and we'll put that X. X is horizontal movement. Y would be vertical movement. Positive numbers move one way. Negative numbers move the opposite way. So we're doing a horizontal X move. And that moves. Oh, look at that. If we wanted to move the other direction, we could do a positive. And it moves the other direction. Oh, look at that. It's pretty cool. But, uh-oh, look at what's happening over here. Now that I'm doing that, look at how it's being cropped off. Remember, I mentioned earlier about a view box. The view box is this box in which you view things. And normally what happens is the stuff outside of that view box, you cannot view it. It's only what you see inside. It's kind of like a cropping box. If it's inside the box, you can view it. If it's outside the box, you cannot view it. But that's just the default styling. So what's happening is as I'm starting further off to the right, and we can exaggerate this if I go further off to the right. So now you can really see it's being cropped off there. I need to make that visible. So all of this is an SVG tag called logo. And up here I have a style for logo. Basically, we have an overflow situation. Our content now is overflowing, sticking outside the boundaries of the view box. And instead of overflow being hidden, I want the overflow to be visible. So even though it's going outside the view box, I still want to be able to see it. That's very important. Now we can still see it even though it's sticking outside that view box. Okay, so that fixes that issue. Very good. Okay, so now we can go back and make this a more reasonable amount. So that can come in. And actually, I want this to kind of come over. I liked the negative that we're doing here, coming from the other direction. Just moves the opposite way. So that kind of comes in this way. And then I want if this is coming to the right, then I want the end background to go to the left. So they're kind of pulling apart from each other. So the end background is that rounded rectangle. So here's that end background with the rounded rectangle. That's what I want to animate next. So I'm going to uncomment this line here. So the timeline, again, every time you put something into a timeline, the first thing you put into the timeline happens first. The second thing you put in is going to happen second because you're putting it into that timeline. As you kind of stick things into a timeline, they slot across going into the future. So if you think about an imaginary timeline starting on the left, going towards the right, the first thing goes on the left, then the next, and then the next, and it's kind of creating this virtual timeline of one thing after another. So the end background is going to come from an opacity of 0, and we'll do the X move as well. It'll take 0.2 seconds, and so it doesn't have to take very long. Sometimes these things are very, very quick. So the Noble Desktop moves over, and then the N, and they're coming in from different directions. Ignore the N because that'll be the next part there. So that's kind of cool. All right, and then it'll look best once we get the full-on N here. The N is that last little colored N part. So we're going to be coming from an opacity of 0, and we're doing the X as well. So same thing, it'll just move in the same direction, just not quite as much. Just move a slightly smaller distance. Still a pretty quick duration, so that animation will happen pretty quickly. Boom, 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 boom. So Noble moves over to the right, and then the logo part, left, left, right, left, left. So those 3 parts. Pretty cool. Now, one of the beauties of the timeline is that if you wanted the icon to build itself first and then the Noble Desktop, if I rearrange these, which in VS Code I can do by holding Option and then using my down arrow to move that down. On Windows, it would be Alt and the up and down arrow just to reorder those lines of code. If I put in the icon and then the Noble Desktop, then those will happen first, because the order in which you put things into your timeline is the order that they animate in. Pretty cool. Pretty quick way to build an animation. Now we can make this even more interesting by adding easing. So I'm going to copy and paste this link here. GreenSock has a great easing visualizer, so you can see what easing is. Now, if you're not familiar with easing, if you've never done animation before, it is changing the rate of speed of the animation. If you have no easing, then it just starts full speed, goes full speed, ends full speed. There's no slowing down at the beginning or end. It's a constant rate of speed. As you start to introduce easing, either at the beginning, which is entering into the animation, or at the end, which is going out of the animation, or you can do both at the start and the end. But let's say I do it at the, let's say I start it with the in. So into the animation, it starts slow. We're easing into it. If you think about a horse, you say, go easy boy, it means to go slow. We ease into the animation and pick up speed as we go through. Now, power 1 is just a subtle ease. And as we go to power 2, it's more extreme. So there's more slowness in the beginning, more speed at the end. Each time we power up, it's further exaggerated. More slow in the beginning, and therefore has to be faster at the end. Again, keep bumping up. Slower at the beginning, faster at the end. And we could do this so that it's both slow at the beginning, fast in the middle, and then slows down at the end. A little bit more like gravity. We can also even overshoot and have to come back. This can be very interesting, especially when we do this, let's say, at the end of our animation, which is the out. We can go too far and have to come back. The final appearance is going to be this. But imagine as we're moving over, instead of just moving over into position, what if we went and we moved over and we went a little too far and had to come back? That would add a little bit of bounce at the end. So that's nice. Now, actually, bounce would give a literal like boing, 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 like a whole different thing. And elastic would be kind of like wiggly back and forth. So I'm just going to do back. So there's just a little bit of like an elasticity, just a little bit at the ends, but it doesn't have like that boing, 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 back and forth. Just a one time, too far, and come back. And down here, it's actually a configurable ease where you can say, I want less, so a smaller amount doesn't go over as much. You can do a bigger amount so it goes over by more and has a bigger stretch at the ends. So you can actually configure how much you want there. And this is the ease option. You can even copy this by clicking copy ease. All right, going back here. So that's what we're doing here. So instead of this, I'm going to comment out those lines. Still do need to create the timeline, which we've done. But instead of doing this without the easing, this time we're going to do it with the easing. Let's close this up. So we've got our timeline that we're putting things into, and we're saying take the Noble Desktop text, take 0.4 seconds, come from an opacity of 0, from an X of -40, and let's put a little bit of easing. We'll use that back out ease, which with a pretty good amount of going too far and having to come back quite a bit. So let's see that. Refresh. So now it gives that nice little bounce back at the end. Let's slow this down so you can see it better. Let's make it take 4 seconds. So it really goes out too far and then has to come back. See? So it overshoots the value and then has to come back. At faster amounts of time, it gives just a little bit of a bounce at the end. And it could be very quick, subtle, but just gives a little bit of livelihood, just a little boing at the end. Got to make your own sound effects. Let's do it for the end background. Again, we're using that back out ease. So all the animation is basically the same here, just kind of putting the ease on there. So boing, boing, and just gives that like last little, just goes a little too far and has to come back. And let's do it on the end as well. So all of these have that back out ease. Boing, 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 boing. And if we slow it down a little bit here, just you might be able to appreciate it more if we slow those down just a bit more. It just goes a little too far. Many times in animation, you don't have to be too slow. Subtlety can be fine. It just gives a little extra life, a little bit more bounce to it. little more realistic movement than just simply just having it start and stop without any sort of easing. So easings can really give a lot of life to your animations. That's just starting to scratch the surface of what you can do with GreenSock. If you want to learn more, definitely check out the GreenSock, Intro to GreenSock video that we have. So that's going to be a wrap for what we're talking about today. If you want to learn more, about things like Figma or Sketch, Adobe XD, or Illustrator, we teach design and coding here in New York City and live online. So you can definitely learn more about these different design apps. If you're interested in learning more about things like JavaScript animation with GreenSock, if you already know HTML and CSS, we've got a JavaScript for front-end course, which gets you into learning JavaScript for people that don't know JavaScript already, that want to get into JavaScript and learn GreenSock. And if you don't know any sort of web coding, or you're just getting started, if you want to dive into a full certificate program, we have web design and web development certificates where you can learn HTML, CSS, JavaScript, GreenSock. You can learn all of those right from the very beginning and learn all of those different things. So I hope this has been interesting for you. This presentation, again, the link is in the video description down below. The first slide has a link to download those sample files. So if you want to get those same files I was demonstrating with and practice on some of those yourself, you can do that. And I hope to see you in a future webinar or a class in New York City. Again, we do have all of our classes scheduled with New York City time, but you can attend those all live online or in person in New York City in our school. But if you want to do those remotely, if you can't make it to the city, you can definitely still enjoy our training, doing live online remote training. So thank you so much and have a wonderful day.